So we spent, when the BLM riots happened and the riot in front of the White House that injured more law enforcement personnel than January 6th, we spent a lot of time talking about why those rioters were mad. They were mad about systemic racism and the death of George Floyd, et cetera. Why do you think the people who swarmed the Capitol on January 6th were mad? And why haven't we talked about that?
Well, first off, I would tell you that I think the January 6th committee was a partisan committee in the Congress of the United States. And it failed its historic mission of bringing the facts forward.
Yep.
And I know your commitment to bringing all the facts to the American people, Tucker. And I know we're grateful for that. The truth of the matter is, as some members of the staff of the January 6th committee said after it adjourned, they spent all their time focused so much on one individual and on placing blame that they spent very little time focusing on law enforcement failures that happened that day and intelligence failures that happened that day. And I hold to the view that we can never let this happen again. We can never allow the capital of the greatest nation on earth to be subject to a riot for any purpose, for any motivation. And for that reason, we need to understand why law enforcement that day was not better equipped, better prepared, where the intelligence failures were. And I believe that in time we'll have those answers.
Amen. But I wonder, though, again, about motives, since these were, and I'm not excusing any act of violence ever anywhere, including on January 6th. However, they were American citizens. Most of them didn't commit acts of violence, and they were really mad. And they were mad because they thought the election was unfair.
Right.
And I wonder why more time hasn't been spent by either party reassuring Americans that our elections are real, that all votes are counted, that the electronic voting machines, which no one seemed to trust 10 years ago, now are infallible, why mail-in voting is a good thing. Like, why doesn't anybody try to reassure the public that the mechanics of voting are legit? And are they? Do you think the last election was fair?
Well, as I said on January 6th in my communication to the Congress, and I've said many times since, there were irregularities in the 2020 election. There's no question. There were about a half a dozen states that changed the rules of elections in the name of COVID.
Yep.
And that undermined public confidence in the outcome of our elections. Now, at the end of the day, we brought more than 60 lawsuits, states engaged in recounts. And when states ultimately certified and courts upheld those changes in virtually every instance, and ultimately we were able to determine that the changes, there was no evidence that the changes had changed the outcome of the election in any way. I knew that my duty was clear that day. But candidly, as I've said before, President Trump's words that day were reckless. I believe whatever his intentions in that moment, it endangered me and my family and everyone that was at the Capitol that day. I believe history will hold him accountable for that, just as the law will hold everyone that engaged in acts of violence.
But may I just get, to the rest of us who weren't there, who were just participating or trying to in our democracy, 10 years ago, Democrats said, look, electronic voting machines can never be secure. And of course, that's obviously true. Anything electronic can be subverted. Real countries don't use electronic voting machines. Are you confident that a country with electronic voting machines, ours, can have an election that you're participating in that everyone can trust?
Well, I believe we can, but I welcome the fact that since 2020, Republican-led states around the country have enacted election integrity reforms. I'm somebody that believes that, and Indiana was the first state to do this. I'm somebody that believes that you ought to be required to give a picture ID when you go in to vote. We ought to have voter ID in every state in America. But with regard to voting machines, I would tell you we had them in Indiana, but in Indiana and elsewhere, they produced paper ballots. Recounts were taken in states around the country. And I think it's absolutely essential that we do everything in our power to restore public confidence in the one person, one vote principle at the heart of this republic.
Why not just get rid of electronic voting machines and call it a day, and then we don't have to debate it?
Well, I would certainly be open to that.
Is there a downside?